I learned Rule 1. Never step into the lift if it arrives without being called on my third night as a watchman. Long before the others trusted me enough to explain why it mattered. That night the sea was calm, but the rig groaned in a way I hadn't heard before, almost like something heavy was moving beneath us. I remember standing in the corridor with the smell of metal dust clinging to my clothes when the lift suddenly arrived on my floor, even though I hadn't pressed anything. At first I thought it was a glitch, something harmless, but then I saw the faint marks on the inside wall, as if something with wet hands had been leaning against it. I stepped closer, expecting to see someone inside, maybe one of the senior crew messing around or testing me. The light inside the lift flickered weakly, giving the illusion of motion where there was none. And for a second, I felt as if the space within it stretched deeper than it should. My breath fogged in the colder air coming from inside, and I remember telling myself it was just the insulation issue the engineers complained about. Still, no one answered when I called out, and the silence inside that small metal box felt too deliberate, almost watchful, as though someone was holding their breath along with me. When the lift doors didn't close, I leaned forward, trying to peek down the shaft as far as I could. The cables hummed faintly, a low vibration that seemed out of sync with the usual rhythm of the machinery. I could tell the lift had moved recently, but nothing about it felt normal. The floor wasn't wet, yet there were streaks of water along the railing, not dripping down but running upward toward the ceiling. I backed away immediately, something in my chest tightening in a way I couldn't explain, a primal signal telling me that whatever left those streaks didn't come from the upper floors. I was about to walk away when I heard footsteps down the corridor, slow and dragging, the kind that came from someone exhausted after a long shift. I relaxed a little, thinking it was probably Rowan heading back from the compressor room. But the moment I turned, the corridor was empty, and the footsteps stopped as sharply as they began. The sudden quiet made the lift's open doorway feel even more like a mouth waiting for something to wander in. I kept glancing back at it, half expecting the doors to close on their own, but they stayed open as if insisting I step inside. When Rowan finally appeared from the opposite direction, he froze the second he saw the open lift. His face went pale, the kind of pale that doesn't come from fear alone, but from memory. He didn't even look inside. He just grabbed my wrist and yanked me away from it. His voice was low, nearly trembling, as he muttered that if the lift came without being called, it wasn't for us. He wouldn't explain further, and his silence made everything worse. It was only later, during a quiet moment in the break room, that he told me the rule existed for a reason. He said the lift occasionally traveled on its own schedule, moving between floors without any human request. The rig had dozens of mechanical quirks, but this one wasn't listed in any maintenance log, and the engineers refused to speak openly about it. The only warning they gave the new crew was simple: if the lift moves without input, step away and don't let it sense your hesitation. Rowan didn't clarify what he meant by sense, but the way he avoided my eyes told me he wasn't using the word metaphorically. The idea that a machine could react to hesitation made my stomach twist in a way no structural failure danger ever had. Later that night, when the crew was asleep, I walked past the lift again, telling myself I wanted to understand what had terrified Rowan so badly. The corridor was dim, the emergency lights casting long shadows that pooled around my boots, and the air smelled faintly of rust and sea brine. I stopped several paces away from the lift, my pulse already beating harder than I'd like to admit. Even with no one around, I felt watched, the same eerie sensation I'd gotten earlier when the empty lift arrived, like it was answering a call no one made. My flashlight beam flickered slightly, the battery not yet low but reacting strangely whenever it pointed toward the metal doors. I crouched near the lift panel, running my fingers lightly across the call button. It was cold, colder than the surrounding wall, as if the temperature dropped where the lift interacted with the structure. I almost pressed it, just to confirm it behaved normally when called properly, but something tightened across my shoulders, a sense that if I touched it without purpose, the lift would respond in a way I wouldn't understand. I straightened, feeling the hairs on my arms rise when I noticed faint smudges on the doors, like handprints or impressions pressed from the inside out. Curiosity pushed me to step closer, but caution kept my feet planted firmly outside the threshold. The air near the doors felt heavier, like standing beside an engine running deep inside the walls, only there was no sound to match the sensation. I imagined something standing just beyond the flickering light, something tall enough to leave marks near the upper frame, something that leaned forward every time the doors opened, waiting. The thought made me swallow hard, wondering how many others had seen what I was seeing now, and refused to speak about it afterward. Silence, I realized, was its own rule on this rig. I forced myself to look away, reminding myself I was supposed to be patrolling, not staring at an empty metal box like it held all the answers. The corridor felt colder now, the wind outside picking up, making the entire rig shift slightly under its weight. I walked past one of the small porthole windows, hoping for some sign of normalcy, but the ocean below was unusually still, its surface dark and glassy, reflecting nothing. Something about that emptiness mirrored the lift perfectly, quiet, waiting, unnatural. I told myself it was just the night playing tricks on me, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. When I finished my rounds and returned to the main deck, Rowan found me again, his face lined with worry. He asked if I'd gone near the lift, and I couldn't bring myself to lie. The moment I admitted I had, his expression tightened, and he warned me that once the lift noticed someone new, it tended to test them. I asked what that meant, but he wouldn't give a straight answer, only saying that it started with harmless appearances, arriving uncalled, lingering longer between floors, small movements that didn't match the panel readings. The real danger, he said, came when someone stepped inside after ignoring these signs. I wanted to dismiss his fear as superstition, but the seriousness in his voice told me otherwise. There was something real beneath his caution, something that had left a mark on him long before I joined the crew. He told me not to wander alone near the shaft for a few nights, especially if I heard anything unusual. The lift, he said, behaved differently when the rig was quiet, like it preferred the silence to make its choices. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the unease growing in my chest told me I needed to listen. That night, as I lay in my bunk, unable to sleep, I kept replaying the moment the lift arrived without being called. I remembered the cold air, the strange streaks, the way the space felt stretched, wrong. I wondered if anyone else had seen something inside those flickering shadows and refused to speak about it. The walls around me creaked, the metal settling with the shifting wind, but every time I heard a distant vibration, I imagined the lift moving on its own, traveling floor to floor like it was searching for someone who hadn't learned the rules yet. I tried to calm my breathing, but the quiet only made my thoughts louder. Somewhere deep within the rig, I felt a faint tremor, not from the machinery, but from the structure itself, as though something was climbing or descending in a place where no human should be. I pressed my hand against the wall beside my bunk, half expecting to feel nothing, but the faint rhythmic movement made my pulse spike. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly, but it felt like something was shifting weight inside the shaft. I didn't want to believe it, but the deeper the tremor echoed, the clearer it became that the lift wasn't the only thing moving in the dark. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay still, but the tremor grew, moving closer to my level, and I knew I had made a mistake by investigating earlier. Whatever Rowan feared, whatever he didn't want to say, it wasn't superstition. It was something that lived in the quiet, something that knew when someone new was paying attention. When the faint vibration reached my floor and stopped abruptly, I felt a cold drop slide down my spine. The lift had arrived again. Even though I was nowhere near it, I knew it was waiting for me. The old technicians used to say that the ocean keeps its own schedule, and none of us are invited to understand it. Down here, shifts blend into one another, until time feels like a rumor. Yet every veteran swears that midnight is different. Sharper, quieter, expectant. That warning became church for us. Especially Rule 2, never open a jammed hatch after midnight. A rule that seemed ridiculous until the first time I heard something on the other side of the steel door. something breathing in a way no machine ever could. I had only been in the trench rig for 3 weeks, still adjusting to the pressure, the groaning pipes, the long corridors lit by flickering emergency tiers. I was trying to convince myself that the ocean's noises were enough to explain anything, but they weren't, not even close. The hatch that everyone feared wasn't even important. Not a main access gate, not a sublock, not something routinely used. It was tucked away in the lower maintenance wing, rusted around the bolts, cold enough that frost formed on the edges, even though the temperature sensors reported normal readings. Officially, it led to an old compression chamber no longer in use, blocked off after a structural failure. Unofficially, it led somewhere else. At least, that's what the whispers suggested. And once you're deep enough, you start understanding that the ocean has rooms inside it we were never meant to map. The first time I walked past that hatch during midnight rounds, I remember feeling pressure shift around me, subtle at first, like an altitude change, until my ears popped hard enough to sting. The lights dimmed so slowly, I thought my eyes were shutting on their own. Then came the tapping, soft, deliberate, spaced evenly, not random like metal settling, more like knuckles. I froze in the hallway and listened. 3 taps, silence. 3 taps again. They echoed so faintly that I couldn't tell if they were coming from the hatch or from inside my skull. I told myself not to get close, not to even breathe too loudly. But when you hear a sound that intentional curiosity becomes a kind of sickness. I leaned forward just enough to place my fingertips on the cold surface. It was vibrating softly, not shaking, vibrating, like something inside was quietly growling. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the corridor wasn't cold enough for that. When I pulled my hand away, the metal skin of the door stayed warm, like someone had just touched it from the other side. I skipped the rest of the maintenance check and went straight to my supervisor's cabin, but the look he gave me before I even opened my mouth told me he already knew what I was going to say. He shut the door behind me and locked it. "You heard it," he whispered, not even bothering with a question. "It's early for you, but not unheard of." I asked him what was down there. He didn't answer. He only rubbed his temples like he was debating whether or not to tell me something he'd regret sharing. "Listen," he said finally. "These places weren't built with perfect blueprints. They were assembled, disassembled, reassembled. Rooms get sealed off, corridors shift, pressure changes, and sometimes the ocean gets inside where it doesn't belong." That didn't answer anything, but the fear in his eyes did. Men who have worked in the deep long enough stop being afraid of rational dangers. Pressure leaks, failing oxygen filters, structural fractures. Those are predictable, manageable. His fear was for something else entirely. For the next few days, I avoided the lower maintenance wing, didn't even pretend to have business there. But it didn't matter. The tapping followed me. Not constantly, just once a night, always at midnight, even if I was on the opposite side of the rig. 3 taps, silence, 3 taps again. At first I thought it was in my head, but then the others began hearing it too. One of the electricians claimed he heard the tapping from inside a locked storage cabinet. The cook swore someone knocked on the freezer door from the inside while he was unloading supplies. No one opened anything. Not after midnight, not ever. One night, during a power fluctuation, alarms briefly cut out and the hallways went dark. I was walking to the engine module when everything flickered once, twice, then went black. The only light came from my handheld torch. And in that silence, total suffocating, I heard it again. Except this time, it wasn't tapping. It was scraping. Long, slow, dragging scratches, like nails tracing the inside of ductwork. They moved above me, then behind me, then ahead. I spun around, breath catching. The sound stopped the moment the lights came back on. But the real problem came 2 nights later, when the hatch jammed completely. It shouldn't have mattered. It wasn't supposed to be opened anyway, but the internal sensors lit up with false readings. Pressure spikes, motion signatures that didn't match human patterns, temperature fluctuations that swung from below freezing to above boiling in seconds. The system flagged it as biological interference. I thought it was a glitch. Most of us did, until the hatch handle turned on its own. It was small, barely half an inch, but enough to show that someone or something on the other side was pulling. Slowly, patiently. One of the senior mechanics bolted the emergency brace across it, muttering prayers under his breath the entire time. The moment the brace clicked into place, the handle jerked violently, as if whatever was behind it realized it had missed a chance. The next morning, during a routine inspection, we found deep indentations on the inner surface of the hatch, fresh ones, not random scratches, finger marks, 5 elongated grooves, spaced like digits, but too long, too sharp, and too far apart to belong to anything human. The metal around them was slightly melted, like heat had been applied in concentrated points. That was when I realized the truth. The thing behind the hatch wasn't trying to get out at random. It was trying to open the door exactly the way a person would. Last night was the worst of all. The alarms blared at midnight. Motion detected again. But this time, the hatch didn't just shake, it buckled. The steel warped inward, like something was pressing its weight against it. The bolts strained. The entire hallway hummed with pressure, like the rig itself was holding its breath. For a moment, I thought the door would give way, and whatever was behind it would finally crawl through. But just as suddenly as it started, the force vanished. The bulkhead normalized, silence returned, and no alarms triggered again. This morning, when I passed the hatch during daylight, everything looked normal. No dents, no heat scoring, no vibration. The corridor was quiet, harmless even. But I know better now. Midnight is coming again, and with it, the tapping will return. It always does. And tonight, the handle will turn farther. The deeper you live under the ocean, the more you learn that sound travels in ways no engineer can fully explain. Pipes carry voices, pressure carries groans, and long steel corridors sometimes feel like they breathe. During my 4th week on the trench rig, I learned the most important part of surviving this place. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps in an empty corridor, walk the other way. It sounds like paranoia, or superstition passed down by workers with too much salt in their blood. But the first time I heard those footsteps, I understood instantly why no one jokes about it. Down here, footsteps don't just signal something approaching, they signal something choosing you. The memory of that night is still sharp, because everything leading up to it felt too normal, too peaceful. Our shifts had been smooth, no pressure spikes, no electrical anomalies, no alarms outside the occasional false readings the rig was infamous for. I had taken the late inspection route through the mid-deck because the usual technician was sick. The corridors were silent, except for the low hum of generators. That hum is comforting. It tells you the rig is alive, working, holding the crushing weight of the Mariana Trench at bay. But halfway through my walk, the hum dipped for a second. Not a full blackout, just a strange soft falter, like the engine skipped a beat. And in that gap, barely a heartbeat long, I heard the first step. It was faint at first, echoing from far down the corridor, a slow, deliberate tap against steel flooring. Then another. The rhythm was wrong. Not the heavy stride of workers wearing weighted boots, not the shuffle of someone tired or rushing. These steps were light, almost thoughtful, like whoever or whatever was walking had all the time in the world. The corridor ahead of me was empty, illuminated all the way to the next junction. Nothing moved. Yet the footsteps grew louder. I should have turned around immediately. Every veteran tells you that hesitation is the danger, not the footsteps themselves. But curiosity is the curse of anyone who works in places humans weren't meant to live. I leaned forward slightly, squinting into the empty hall, trying to see if the sound was traveling from an echo chamber or faulty ventilation. My mind begged for a logical explanation, but my body knew better. My pulse climbed, and a coldness crept up my spine as the steps suddenly paused, exactly when I did. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't an echo. It was mimicking me. I took a single cautious step backward. The sound answered instantly. One soft footstep forward from the empty corridor ahead. I didn't breathe after that. My throat locked up and my muscles refused to obey. Every instinct screamed that if I stayed still, something would come into view, and whatever it was would not be human. Then the corridor lights flickered, not fully off, just a trembling shimmer, like a current wave hitting the electrical lines. And in that stutter of light, shadows shifted along the far wall, not from anything visible, just stretching shapes bending in directions they shouldn't. When the light steadied, the hall was empty again, but the footsteps resumed. Faster this time, closer. That broke the paralysis. I turned and walked, not ran. Running is a mistake, they say. Running draws attention. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, even though every cell in my body screamed to sprint. The footsteps matched me perfectly at first. Then they grew quicker, like whoever was following me was excited. The sound was wrong again. Not heavy boots, not soft socks, but something sharper, like bare feet slapping steel lightly. By the time I reached the junction, my hands were shaking. I turned left, heading toward the auxiliary storage sector. The footsteps didn't follow. They continued straight down the main hall, fading slowly until the pressure-dampened silence returned. I leaned against the wall and exhaled shakily, realizing I had been holding my breath for almost an entire minute. The next morning, I asked around casually, pretending to joke about phantom steps. No one laughed. One of the older crew members, a deep-sea welder who had been here nearly 12 years, didn't even look up from the tablet he was checking. He just muttered, "You heard them, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He told me the story every newcomer eventually hears. The footsteps started after the first expansion of the rig, when they built new corridors over abandoned ones that had partially flooded and collapsed. A diver went missing during that construction phase, never recovered. Some people think the footsteps belong to him, still wandering the hallways he died in. Others think the ocean leaves impressions, like fingerprints, of whatever it consumes, and sometimes those impressions move. What unsettled me most wasn't the idea of some lingering presence, but the welder's last comment before he walked away. He said, "They only follow the ones the rig chooses." He didn't explain what that meant. No one ever does. 2 nights later, I learned the footsteps weren't confined to the mid-deck. I was in the upper engine corridor checking valve readouts when the low hum dipped again. A split second of wrongness, then tap, 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 this time from behind me. My mouth went dry instantly. The corridor behind me stretched long and perfectly straight, lined with pipes and red maintenance lights that never flickered. But in that moment, those lights seemed to dim, as though something tall had moved between them and the main power line. I didn't turn around. Every survival instinct I had sharpened into a single truth. If I looked back, I wouldn't like what I saw. The footsteps came closer. Slow, patient, no attempt to hide. I made myself walk forward, one step, another. My legs were trembling so badly, I felt like a baby deer learning to stand. But I didn't stop. I didn't look. The footsteps kept following, closing the distance by inches. The corridor felt longer than it ever had, stretching endlessly as the sound behind me grew sharp enough that I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. Then the emergency alarm blared, short, sharp, signaling nothing critical, just a sensor misread. But the moment it sounded, the footsteps stopped dead, not faded, stopped instantly, like whatever was behind me vanished in an instant. When I finally reached the secure bulkhead door and closed it behind me, I slid down to the floor, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Since then I've mapped every shortcut, every alternative route, every narrow maintenance path that avoids long stretches of hallway. I'm not the only one. Everyone down here walks with a kind of practiced paranoia, because once you hear footsteps in an empty corridor, you never forget the sound, and you never forget that something down here is following you quietly, patiently, waiting for the day you turn the wrong way. The North Sea storms weren't just bad weather. they were alive. When the wind howls through the rig, and the waves crash against the support beams with enough force to make the entire structure shudder, it feels as though the ocean itself is trying to peer inside. That's why I learned Rule 4. Never look directly at the windows. During a storm, a rule that sounds simple until you understand what's really behind the glass. One night the sky opened in a torrent, wind lashing through the deck doors, and the lights flickering in rhythm with the rig's tremors. I was checking sensor readouts when the first flash of lightning revealed movement on the horizon. Or at least, I thought it was the horizon. The first time it happened, I caught just a glimpse. A shadow that moved contrary to the waves, something so tall and rigid that my mind refused to place it in context with reality. My head jerked away instinctively, but the image was seared into my memory, the kind that lingers even when you close your eyes. The rig's design didn't help. The windows stretch wide across observation decks and hallways, reflecting interior lights when you turn to look. If your mind isn't steady, it tricks you into seeing things that shouldn't be there, figures that aren't human, shapes that bend against logic. I tried convincing myself it was just a trick of the storm, reflections, shadows, or the rhythm of lightning. But the next few nights told a different story. Every time a storm passed, even in the dimmest flashes of light, I could sense something moving outside the rig. Something pacing along the support beams, gliding across the water's surface without sinking. I learned to cover the windows in emergency tarps, tape, anything to prevent me from seeing that fleeting, impossible motion. It was almost as if the storm itself carried awareness, selecting moments when the unlucky watchman would glance outside and see what shouldn't exist. One evening, Rowan joined me while I was securing the observation deck. He didn't speak much, just motioned for me to stay behind the tarp. The wind tore at the rig, rattling metal plates and whistling through cracks. "I've seen enough to know," he said quietly. "Once you look, it remembers." I stared at him blankly. He didn't elaborate. That wasn't his style. The implication was worse than any explanation. If you made eye contact through the glass during a storm, it would somehow mark you. And the thought of being marked by something beyond comprehension beneath all that water made my chest tighten. Storms became a calculated danger. I timed my rounds, scheduled checks in areas without windows, and avoided being alone. Yet one night, curiosity and exhaustion overcame me. I stood in front of a large window for a split second, thinking I'd been careful, that a storm was just starting on the horizon. The glass fogged from the inside with my breath, lightning slicing the sky, and then I saw it. Not a shadow, not a reflection, but a figure. A presence taller than any man, hunched in a way that bent against physics, limbs that stretched and contracted unnaturally, staring straight at me. I froze, my heart hammered like the waves against the hull. Lightning flashed again, and it vanished. I thought it had been an optical illusion, a trick of my panic, until the next day when the security monitors recorded a faint silhouette on the exterior cameras. The figure appeared only for milliseconds, yet it matched every detail I had seen through the window. I couldn't explain how it moved so silently, or how it seemed to float atop the ocean rather than sink. Rowan didn't need an explanation. He just said, "You broke the rule." That statement, simple and cold, carried a weight I couldn't ignore. After that night, I developed a protocol. Tarps were mandatory, internal lights dimmed, and no one moved near windows during storms without at least one other person present. Storms on the North Sea rig weren't just natural disasters, they were warnings. Some nights, even when the wind wasn't strong, I could hear faint scraping, subtle taps, almost like claws against metal, coinciding with distant thunder. It didn't take much to associate those noises with the figure outside. The rig became claustrophobic. Every window felt like a temptation, every reflection a potential invitation for the unseen to mark you. One storm, stronger than usual, ripped through the rig with unrelenting fury. I was trapped on the observation deck, alone for what felt like hours, securing sensors and checking structural integrity. The lights flickered in a rhythm that synced with my heartbeat, then all went black for a moment. When they returned, I noticed a handprint on the inside of the glass, wet, tall, human-shaped but elongated. like it had been pressed by something unnatural. I recoiled, my mind refusing to process the implications. I had been careful, but maybe not careful enough. Maybe just being near the window had been enough to draw attention. I remember calling Rowan, voice trembling, explaining what I saw. He didn't scold me, he didn't need to. His silence was the only acknowledgement necessary. He knew I had broken Rule 4, never look directly at the windows during a storm, and that knowledge hung between us heavier than the storm itself. He told me not to go near that deck again for at least a week, not because of structural danger, but because it would come back, sooner or later, to see who had dared to look. That week, sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind, every shudder of the rig, made me flinch toward windows. Each time I thought I heard a whisper or a soft tap on the metal, I reminded myself Rowan was right. Storms remember, and storms witness. Even in interior corridors, far from any glass, the presence seemed to creep, carried in the rhythm of water and metal, a subtle pressure against my mind. The storm didn't have to touch me directly. Its effects traveled through every beam, every cable, every gust that rattled the rig. By the time the storm passed, the ocean returned to its flat, dark monotony, but the memory lingered. I could feel eyes following me, even when no window was in sight. The rig's corridors seemed to twist slightly, subtle distortions in my perception that weren't there before. I knew the rule wasn't about the glass itself, it was about acknowledging the presence outside. To look directly meant recognition. Recognition meant attention, and attention on this rig almost never ends well. I shared the experience with a new recruit one morning, warning him not to test the windows during storms. He scoffed, clearly thinking it was superstition. But then, during a sudden squall, a gust rattled the exterior panels and something outside shifted. He froze, his eyes locking on the observation deck glass. I grabbed his arm and pulled him away, shouting that it wasn't worth the risk. He struggled, eyes wide, finally understanding that some warnings on this rig are not optional. They are survival instructions, encoded in fear, passed down from every watchman who has survived long enough to tell the story. Even now, when storms approach, I can feel the instinctual pull to glance at the windows. Every fiber in me wants to see it again, just to confirm it exists, just to prove I'm not crazy. But I don't. I turn, I retreat, I move along internal corridors where the glass can't trap my gaze. And I know that if I fail, if I ever meet those eyes through the storm again, the rig won't help me. The ocean outside isn't just water, it's a patient observer, and storms are its eyes, and I've learned that nothing survives once it knows you've looked too closely. The lesson is simple: the moment you feel tempted, the moment lightning flashes through the rig, and you sense movement, avert your eyes, step back, breathe, remember the rule, and wait for the storm to pass without curiosity, because if you don't, the consequences aren't immediate. They're patient, persistent, and almost invisible until the rig itself begins to whisper warnings. And even then, it might be too late to do anything but survive until the next storm arrives. The engine room always felt alive, like the rig's beating heart, but at night it becomes something else entirely. An entity that watches, waits, and listens. I first understood Rule 5, never enter the engine room alone at night, during a late shift, when a minor power fluctuation sent me to check the secondary generators. I told myself it was just routine maintenance, a simple inspection, but the deeper I walked into that metallic cavern, the more the familiar hum of the machinery began to feel like breathing. Not mechanical, not human, but aware, deliberate. Every panel, every valve, every hanging chain seemed to stretch slightly toward me, as though curious, as though anticipating my next step. It started with the sounds, familiar at first, the rhythmic thrum of pistons, the low hiss of pressure valves, but then subtle variations crept in. Soft scuttling that wasn't explained by normal machinery, shadows in corners that moved contrary to the lights above. I froze and pressed my palm to the cold metal wall, telling myself it was fatigue, imagination, the rig's steel warping in the cold North Sea. But when the echo of footsteps, soft and deliberate, came from behind one of the generator blocks, I realized this place had its own rules. rules that had nothing to do with physics or engineering. The lights flickered as I advanced, and the deeper I moved, the more oppressive the air became. It smelled metallic, oily, and faintly brine-soaked. My eyes kept darting to the catwalks and shadows, expecting to see a crew member, a janitor, anyone, but the engine room was empty. Completely empty, yet I could feel eyes on me, lingering, patient, following my every motion. It's a sensation that doesn't leave you, one that wraps around your spine and settles like ice in your bones. That was the moment I realized why the rule existed, because the machinery itself wasn't entirely inanimate. I should have left immediately, but pride and curiosity pushed me further in. The first generator block had a minor malfunction, one I could fix easily. I bent over, adjusting valves and resetting circuits, but a sudden vibration across the floor caused my wrench to slip. I looked up, and for the briefest moment, I could swear the shadows in the far corner of the room bent toward me. I stepped back instinctively, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. The lights flickered violently, then steadied. Everything looked normal, but the feeling remained, the sense that the engine room had noticed me, that it had waited for me alone. I called Rowan on the radio, thinking perhaps he could monitor me remotely. The static crackle of the handset answered, followed by his low voice, "Don't linger in there. Don't stay alone." I wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but another vibration ran through the floor, and my own voice caught in my throat. The room was too quiet now. Silence hung like a curtain over the machinery, broken only by the low hum of the main generator. That hum suddenly dropped in pitch, just for a fraction of a second, and my stomach sank. Movement. Behind me. Not fast, slow, deliberate, almost stretching across the floor without making sound. I spun, flashlight beam cutting across the metallic catwalks. Nothing visible. But the temperature dropped sharply, the cold cutting through my uniform like icy fingers. My breath fogged the dim light, and a strange metallic scent filled the air. It wasn't just oil or brine anymore. It was something alive, something patient, smelling me, counting me, calculating. That was when I realized the engine room isn't just a room. It's a sentinel. It's a sentinel, a living trap that only permits entry to those who respect its rules. I moved carefully toward the exit, every step measured. The floor beneath me hummed with power. Wires vibrated faintly in response to something unseen. An overhead chain swayed even though the ventilation was still. I could hear nothing human, nothing natural, yet every sound I expected, screws tightening, valves releasing, machinery cycling, was exaggerated in rhythm, echoing too long, echoing too deep. By the time I reached the far side of the room, I could feel a presence at my shoulder, not touching, not moving, but hovering just enough to distort my peripheral vision. I didn't dare look directly at it. That was a mistake I wouldn't make again. Later, during the daytime inspection, I found subtle signs of intrusion that had gone unnoticed by maintenance logs. Small indentations on the generator casings, scratches along the edges where nothing should reach, faint wet streaks in areas I'd been alone at night. Nothing visible remained, but the evidence confirmed what I'd already suspected. The engine room recognizes trespassers. It doesn't act immediately, not violently. Instead, it watches, experiments, and teaches lessons slowly, patiently. Some of the older crew whispered that the rig itself learns who breaks the rules, that those who enter the engine room alone at night sometimes disappear, or worse, are left altered, changed, marked. I tested the theory cautiously on another night, deliberately stepping near the generator blocks in pairs with another crew member. No immediate reactions, no strange vibrations. When we moved together, the room behaved as if we were invisible. Solo patrols were different. Alone, it responded to hesitation, to awareness. Lights flickered, shadows shifted, chains swayed, air seemed to thicken, slowing movement. I never disobeyed the rule again after that night, not once. Even after months, the memory of that room, empty yet aware, never left me. The engine room also has a psychological effect. Even hours after leaving, I could hear subtle echoes in my mind, mechanical rhythms, out of sync with reality, soft taps where nothing exists, faint whispers in the corner of my hearing. Other crew members reported similar symptoms after solo inspections. Rowan once described it as the engine room reaching into your mind, testing the space between thought and fear. I never understood what he meant fully, until much later, but I could feel it, the pull, the weight of invisible scrutiny. By the time I left the room for the last check of my shift, I knew exactly why the rule existed. Alone, it becomes a trap. Machines themselves can't kill you directly, but the rig can isolate, manipulate, and terrify. Walking alone at night inside that engine room is an invitation, and the rig remembers those invitations. The slightest hesitation, the slightest curiosity, will be answered, and when the lights flicker in the darkness, and the hum slows in an unnatural way, it's already too late. The real lesson of Rule 5 is subtle. The rig watches you and you are never alone. It tests your awareness, patience, and fear. Ignoring the rule doesn't just put your life at risk, it shifts the balance of the rig's attention toward you. By the time you realize something is wrong, it's already decided whether to ignore, observe, or engage. Every night I patrol the engine room with at least one other person now. The moment I hear that first strange vibration in the steel floor, I don't stop, I move, and I remind myself quietly, repeatedly, that I will never again enter the engine room alone at night, because I've felt what happens to those who do. Even now, long after that first night, I still feel its presence when I pass the room. The hum of the generators is no longer comforting, it is a reminder, a warning. I glance at the catwalks and pipes, half expecting movement, and sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear the chains sway just a little, though there's no breeze, no ventilation, nothing. The rig remembers those who break the rule, and it waits, patiently, watching, teaching. The rig has a symphony of alarms, warnings for pressure leaks, electrical failures, and structural shifts. But some alarms aren't linked to anything tangible. I first experienced Rule 6. Never ignore the faint alarms that sound without cause. During a night when the wind had died down, and the sea was unnaturally still, I was walking the upper deck after my shift, notebook in hand, recording minor maintenance anomalies, when a faint chime resonated from the control panel. It wasn't a typical warning. No red lights flashed, no error codes appeared, yet the sound persisted, quiet but insistent, threading through the metal corridors like a whisper. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was a glitch in the sensors, or my own fatigue. But then it repeated, a subtle three-note sequence, faint but unmistakable. I froze, listening, realizing this wasn't just a random electronic hiccup. There was a rhythm to it, an irregular precision that felt deliberate. It echoed through the decks, bouncing off steel beams and piping, moving in patterns that no human or machine should manage. The sensation that someone or something was trying to communicate through the rig's systems made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I followed the sound to the secondary monitoring station, the faint beeping guiding me like a pulse. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the metal floor was resisting movement, slowing my approach. When I reached the console, all readings appeared normal. No pressure anomalies, no electrical issues, nothing. I checked the logs. The systems reported no faults, no triggers, nothing that would explain the subtle, persistent chime. Yet the sound remained, just low enough to unsettle, high enough to demand attention. I realized immediately why the rule existed. Ignoring it was not a choice. It was the beginning of exposure. As I stood frozen, Rowan appeared behind me without warning. His face was pale, eyes sharp. "You hear it, don't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "It's not a malfunction," he said. "It's something else entirely. You have to respond, even if there's nothing to respond to. That's the rule." He didn't elaborate further. I didn't need him to. Experience had taught him, and now me, that the faint, untraceable alarms were never idle. They were testing you, marking you, revealing who is cautious and who is careless. That realization made my pulse quicken. I began tracing the alarm's source, following the wiring conduits into the lower decks, corridors that seemed impossibly long in the dim emergency lights. The chime persisted, moving with me, faint but insistent, always just ahead. It was almost alive, like a creature navigating the labyrinthine rig. The smell of metal, oil and brine grew stronger as I approached the machinery rooms, and shadows stretched unnaturally across walls, elongating in ways the rig's geometry shouldn't allow. I understood then that ignoring this sound would have been fatal. The rig itself would have noticed my hesitation. At one point, I paused to recalibrate my flashlight. The beam flickered, and the sound of the alarm intensified, echoing through the empty hallways like an urgent heartbeat. I realized then that the faint alarms were less about a mechanical error and more about presence, awareness, and vigilance. Something in the rig listens and watches, and these subtle signals were the only warnings it sends before acting. If ignored, it doesn't stop. It waits, patient and deliberate, until the person learns through experience, sometimes painfully, why attention is mandatory. The corridors became narrower, the piping denser, almost like the rig was closing in on me. I could feel vibrations underfoot, minor tremors that weren't reported by the pressure sensors. I stopped at an intersection and listened carefully. The alarm was now moving laterally, as if tracing a pattern across the rig's structure. I debated whether to proceed alone, but instinct told me to follow. I moved cautiously, flashlight beam cutting across walls, pipes, and support beams, ears straining for any anomaly. Every shadow seemed to twitch in rhythm with the faint chime, as though the rig's very essence was alive. I encountered a maintenance panel, one I rarely used, its doors slightly ajar. The faint alarm led me directly to it. I hesitated, hand on the edge, feeling the vibration from the machinery inside. Opening it might expose something, but ignoring it wasn't an option. I slid the door open, revealing nothing but wires, switches, and conduits. Yet the alarm sounded louder now, not mechanically, but perceptually. The rig seemed to whisper, reminding me that the warning wasn't about what I could see. It was about acknowledging presence, respecting the space, and acting on instinct. I pressed the manual override on the panel, and the faint chime stopped. For a moment, silence reigned. The air seemed to lighten, though shadows still clung to corners. I felt relief, but it was fleeting. I had merely passed one test. The rig doesn't forget, doesn't forgive, and doesn't allow negligence. I understood then that Rule 6 was less about the alarm itself and more about cultivating awareness, learning to respond, to act, to survive when the rig whispers and shakes in ways the human mind cannot rationalize. That night, when the rig settled into its normal hum and the lights stabilized, I could still feel the faint resonance of the alarm in my chest. Every minor vibration, every echo in the hallways, reminded me that ignoring signals, no matter how subtle, invites attention. Rowan later explained that many accidents on deep-sea rigs are preceded by ignored cues, minor sounds, overlooked vibrations, or faint signals. He never said exactly what happens if you ignore them, only that those who do rarely continue to work without consequence. I didn't want to test it again. The lesson cemented itself in me. Vigilance is survival. The faint alarms are more than just mechanical alerts. They are the rig speaking, a language of awareness and caution. Each time I patrol alone now, I listen carefully, never dismissing a subtle chime or vibration. It's an unspoken conversation, one I cannot afford to ignore. The rig demands recognition, and the moment you fail to acknowledge it, it begins to mark you, assess you, and prepare for the eventual test. By the time I finished my rounds, I understood completely why ignoring faint alarms is forbidden. They are not anomalies, nor are they accidental. They are the rig's way of interacting with its human occupants, its subtle warnings before more overt measures manifest. The faint chimes are patience incarnate, silent yet unyielding, and acknowledging them is the only way to maintain a semblance of safety. I move through the corridors cautiously, listening, waiting, and never forgetting that the rig is alive, and its whispers are not to be ignored. The diving bell sat in its station like a relic, cold, metallic, and forbidding. Yet its purpose was clear: to carry us down to depths that seemed impossible, to places where the sunlight never reached. I first learned Rule 7. Never touch the diving bell after it has been used. One night, when an emergency retrieval was ordered due to a sensor malfunction near the lower trench level, the bell had just returned from a deep dive, and its outer surface glistened with condensation and salt, a thin layer hiding the dents, scratches, and tiny smears that no human eye would normally notice. My hand itched to inspect it, to touch and examine the bell as part of my routine maintenance. But Rowan's voice cut through my curiosity like a blade. "Leave it alone. Never touch it. You don't know what comes back with it." I hesitated, gripping the railing near the bell, feeling the vibrations from its internal systems slowly dissipate into the deck. Inside, it smelled metallic, with a hint of brine, and I could feel the residual pressure lingering as though the bell exhaled after its descent. The last crewman who had returned from the trench had said nothing, but his eyes told a story of strain, of tension, of something that lingered in a place too deep for normal human perception. The bell was more than a vessel. It was a passageway, a threshold, and the warning made sense. Touching it after a dive wasn't just against protocol, it was a direct invitation to the unknown that had followed it up from the abyss. That night, after ensuring no other personnel were nearby, I approached the bell cautiously. Even standing close, I could feel a strange magnetic pull, subtle yet undeniable, tugging at my gloves, my jacket, and even my heartbeat. The rig's lights reflected across the polished metal, but the reflection seemed distorted, bending in ways impossible for glass and steel. My shadow stretched unnaturally along the deck, mingling with the bell's own silhouette. I resisted the urge to reach out, remembering Rowan's warning, but the instinct to inspect, to understand, was almost overwhelming. That's when I noticed a faint smudge along the hatch, dark and wet, like oil mixed with something unidentifiable. My fingers itched to trace it, to see what lay beneath, but I forced myself back. Hours passed, and I patrolled the surrounding area, keeping my distance from the bell. Occasionally I glanced at it, seeing subtle movements that could have been tricks of the light, or something else entirely. The bell seemed to breathe, expanding slightly with the air inside, contracting, shifting imperceptibly, as if the pressure it contained wasn't entirely regulated by the mechanical systems. Every vibration of the rig echoed in its frame, giving it a presence far beyond its physical mass. I understood then why the rule existed. The bell carries more than just humans. It carries the echoes of the trench, and sometimes, those echoes linger in ways that can't be explained. Later, Rowan approached, moving quietly, eyes scanning the bell like a predator watching prey. "Some of us touch it anyway," he said softly, almost to himself, "and never come back the same." I asked him what he meant. He didn't elaborate, only gestured to the shadowed corners of the rig, where pipes and maintenance structures intersected like claws, casting long shapes across the deck. I could feel a tension in the air, subtle and heavy, that seemed to affirm his words. Touching the bell after a dive wasn't just unsafe. It was disrespectful to forces the human mind isn't meant to engage. That night, I avoided the bell entirely, yet sleep was impossible. I could hear faint knocks and taps from within its frame, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing in my dreams, even when my eyes were closed. It felt alive, aware, waiting for an opportunity to react to human error. Every time I shifted in my bunk, I felt a slight pull toward it, like it was calling, reminding me of the rule. The fear wasn't immediate or physical, it was subtle, psychological, embedding itself in thought patterns, in hesitations, in the feeling that the rig and the bell were aware of my every action. A few days later, during routine checks, a new diver approached the bell, and ignoring the posted instructions, ran his hands across its cold surface. The air immediately changed. The lights flickered violently, and the pressure monitors spiked briefly, though they stabilized within seconds. He stepped back, confused, dismissing it as a glitch. I didn't speak. I knew the rig had marked him, noticed him, and waited. The bell doesn't forgive curiosity. It allows it, tests it, and then responds on its own schedule. The implications of touching it are not instantaneous. They are slow, insidious, psychological, sometimes physical, and always consequential. Even during daylight hours, I noticed subtle signs, condensation patterns on the bell forming shapes, faint scratches on the deck near the hatch that weren't there previously, tiny droplets that seemed to move against gravity. I began to patrol around it systematically, mapping every anomaly, noting every deviation from normal readings. The bell became more than a machine. It was an entity, a sentinel, a threshold of both depth and danger. The more I respected it, the calmer the rig seemed to be, but one misstep, one moment of carelessness, and everything could change. Rowan always reminded me, the bell isn't just metal and air, it carries the depths inside it, and the depths don't forget. At night, the rig settled into silence, generators humming, steel groaning, and yet the bell seemed to radiate its own energy, faint but palpable. I could feel its presence in the metal floor beneath my boots, in the vibrations that ran along the support beams, in the shadows bending unnaturally across the deck. Touching it after a dive is tempting for those who don't understand. For those who do, the temptation is almost unbearable, an itch that's impossible to scratch, a reminder that boundaries exist for survival. I had come close before, but never crossed the line again, and the subtle fear it instilled was enough to keep me vigilant. The rig's veterans never explain fully what happens when the bell is touched after a dive. The consequences vary. Some experience paranoia, subtle hallucinations, unexplained bruises, or a persistent feeling of being watched. Others report faint whispers, shadows lingering in peripheral vision, machinery behaving strangely. Rowan once said, "It's not the bell that punishes you, it's what comes with it." The trench leaves marks, and the bell carries them up. That's why I never touched it again. I understood that some rules are not about immediate danger, but about cumulative consequences, awareness, and survival. By the end of my shift, I had circled the bell 3 times, inspecting, noting anomalies, but never touching. I reminded myself quietly, as I had many times before, that Rule 7 exists because the diving bell is more than a vessel, it's a boundary. Crossing it, even casually, invites attention, curiosity, and consequences the human mind may never fully comprehend. The rig itself seemed calmer, as though satisfied with my vigilance. I knew, deep down, that one careless moment could undo months of survival. Even now, I keep a mental distance from the bell whenever possible, checking it only visually, never physically. I've seen what happens to those who ignore this rule, and the results are subtle yet persistent, like shadows following your thoughts. The bell waits quietly, patient and aware, its metallic surface reflecting not only light, but attention, curiosity, and potential danger. I never ever forget. Rule 7. The submerged sections of the rig are a different world, dark, claustrophobic, and alive with the constant pressure of the deep sea. I first realized Rule 8, never enter the submerged sections without a partner. During a routine inspection, when a minor leak was detected in the lower compartments, I thought I could handle it alone, confident in my skills and equipment. I ignored the uneasy feeling in my gut, dismissing it as paranoia. As I descended the ladder into the flooded sections, the water rose to just below my chest, and the steel walls felt as though they were pressing in, restricting every movement. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the compartment. At first, the task seemed simple. I located the leak, traced it along the corroded piping, and began tightening valves. But as I moved, subtle disturbances appeared, small ripples in water that shouldn't have moved, shadows flickering under the surface, echoes that weren't mine. Every instinct screamed that I wasn't alone, that the submerged sections had noticed my solitary presence. My flashlight beam cut through the murky water, illuminating pipes and support beams, but in the corners, where the light barely reached, I could see shapes moving in ways impossible for human bodies. Halfway through the inspection, I heard a faint scraping behind me. My heart jumped. The noise didn't belong to any machinery or maintenance tool. I turned slightly, holding my breath, but the corridor behind me was empty. Yet the water shifted unnaturally, as though something massive had moved beneath the surface. That was when I truly understood the rule. Submerged sections aren't just flooded compartments. They're living, observing spaces, alone. You become a target, a disturbance in the delicate balance of pressure, water and steel. I considered calling Rowan, but the radio signals in the submerged sections are unreliable. Static dominates, and even a clear message can arrive distorted or delayed. Panic began to creep in as I realized the true risk of solitary entry. Without a partner, there's no verification, no backup, no witness to confirm reality. Everything feels amplified. The echoing drips, the shifting water, the shadows that may or may not exist. A small misstep in the submerged sections can quickly become catastrophic, from slipping on algae-slick metal to being trapped in a corridor that twists impossibly as the rig bends under pressure. As I navigated deeper, I became acutely aware of the rig's design: twisting corridors, narrow maintenance tunnels, pipes crisscrossing the submerged areas like veins. The water distorted every sound, making it impossible to judge distance or direction accurately. I lost track of time, movement slowed, muscles cramping from the cold and resistance. It felt like the water itself was testing me, pulling against my limbs, trying to delay, confuse and isolate me further. That's why the rule exists. Isolation amplifies the danger, not just from the environment, but from what inhabits these spaces. At one point, I reached a junction where two corridors merged. A shadow flickered at the far end, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't human, but it moved with intent, deliberate and fluid. I reminded myself of the rule. If I had been accompanied, the fear would have been mitigated. My partner could observe, react, confirm reality, or intervene. Alone, I felt every second stretch, every shadow loom, every ripple magnified into a potential threat. The submerged sections were teaching me a lesson in patience and caution, one that could be deadly if ignored. Slowly, I backed away, trying to retrace my steps, but the maze-like corridors made orientation difficult. My flashlight's beam wavered, reflections bouncing off walls and water, creating phantom images. I could feel the weight of the water pressing down, constricting movement, but worse was the awareness that I wasn't entirely alone. Something was tracking me, moving with me, perfectly synchronized yet invisible. I realized that solitary entry is not just dangerous, it invites observation, and observation can turn to interaction in ways no human mind can fully prepare for. By the time I reached the ladder back to the main deck, I was drenched, exhausted, and shaken. The submerged sections had made their presence undeniable, but I had survived, barely. I called Rowan, voice trembling, explaining the situation. He listened without interrupting, then said flatly, "You ignored Rule 8. Don't ever do it again." The bluntness of his tone left no room for argument. I understood completely. The submerged sections are unforgiving to those who enter alone. They are not merely physical spaces, but sentient thresholds that monitor and test anyone who dares enter without a partner. Weeks later, I observed new recruits being trained on the submerged sections. The instructors emphasized teamwork, constant communication, and never straying from assigned paths. Even minor deviations were corrected immediately. The rig enforces compliance through environmental hazards, psychological strain, and subtle manipulations of perception. Alone, one is vulnerable to every anomaly, every irregularity, every subtle sign that something is alive and aware. The lesson was clear: solitude in submerged sections is an invitation to danger, an acknowledgement that the rig's depth is beyond human control. I now patrol these areas exclusively with partners, maintaining constant visual and auditory contact. Even a few feet of separation triggers unease, a subtle tension that runs through the water and metal. I've seen shadows react to movement, ripples propagate without cause, and subtle vibrations signal presence far beyond what sensors report. These observations confirm the rule: never enter the submerged sections alone. The risk is not just environmental, it's existential. The rig, the water, the shadows all watch, all test, all remember. Even now, I can't enter those flooded compartments without a partner. I've experienced the consequences of solitary exploration firsthand: fear magnified, orientation compromised, presence noted. Every ripple, every shadow, every vibration reinforces the importance of vigilance and partnership. The submerged sections are alive, patient, and aware. Ignoring the rule is tempting for those seeking shortcuts or thrill, but the rig does not forgive. I never ever enter alone anymore, and I keep the lesson fresh in my mind, a constant reminder that some rules are not optional, they are survival. The first time I heard it, I froze mid-step on the rig's lower platform, feeling the vibration of waves against steel, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. That was when I realized Rule 9: never respond to voices that call your name from the depths. I had been checking the external sensors near the submerged sections, the same ones I now never approached alone. The wind and the machinery masked the sound at first, a subtle, airy murmur that seemed human, but impossibly distant. Then it became unmistakable, a whisper, soft but urgent, carrying my name clearly across the water. My breath caught, heart pounding. It wasn't possible. I was alone. No one was in range to call me. For a moment, my rational mind argued it was just a reflection of the wind, a trick of acoustics, or perhaps my exhaustion catching up. Yet instinct screamed that this was different. The sound had a texture, a timbre, a cadence that was entirely wrong for human speech, yet intimately familiar. It tugged at something primal within me, urging me to answer, to turn toward the voice. I resisted, but the urge to respond grew with every second. That is exactly why the rule existed. Once you acknowledge the voice, even in thought, it begins to manipulate you, testing boundaries and patience, luring you into spaces where the rig and the sea converge into something alive. I moved cautiously toward the origin of the sound, flashlight in hand, but immediately felt the change in the air. The metal walls and pipes vibrated subtly. The water in the submerged sections pulsed like a heartbeat, and shadows seemed to lean closer as I advanced. Every instinct screamed retreat, but the whispers persisted, persistent yet always just out of reach, always teasing my curiosity. I remembered Rowan's warning: the depths know your name, and using it is a method of control, a lure designed to test discipline and fear. The rig isn't merely a structure, it participates in the manipulation, amplifying the voices, masking the true danger, and ensuring no one acts impulsively. I tried speaking, just a muttered confirmation to calm my racing thoughts. The sound shifted, aligning with my voice. I could swear it mimicked my tone, weaving familiarity into the unnatural cadence. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned and backed toward the ladder, forcing rationality over instinct, repeating the rules silently to myself: never respond, never engage. One misstep, one acknowledgement, and the game begins. The rig, the water, the unseen forces in the submerged sections, they all notice, and their attention is patient, deliberate, and unyielding. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as I carefully retreated, the whispers receding, but never disappearing entirely. The deeper I went, the more distorted the sound became, fragments of my own voice echoing back from impossible angles, forming sentences I didn't say, questions I hadn't asked. I realized then that the rule wasn't just about audible warning, it was about preserving sanity. Responding, even mentally, creates a bridge between your consciousness and the unknown in the depths. That bridge is fragile and dangerous. One false step, one acknowledgement, and it strengthens the connection in ways the human mind cannot withstand. By the time I reached the upper deck, sweat running down my temple, the sound faded into the ordinary hum of rig machinery and waves against steel. Yet the memory persisted, embedding itself in my nerves, a constant warning. I reported nothing immediately, fearing ridicule, but Rowan understood. He never explained fully, only nodded. "You heard it, that's enough. Don't ever acknowledge it again," he said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. I realized the rig, the ocean, and whatever resides in the submerged sections maintain rules that humans must respect, without question, especially when they use your name. That night, sleep was uneasy. Every minor sound, pipes groaning, water dripping, air hissing, made me flinch. I could imagine voices calling from below, imitating my name, bending the rhythm of my own thoughts to their will. I understood why those before me had disappeared, why some refused to descend again. Acknowledging the voices invites attention, and attention in these depths can escalate quickly. The rig doesn't forgive curiosity. The water doesn't forgive distraction. The voices are patient predators, waiting for hesitation, doubt, or recognition. The next morning, I patrolled the submerged sections with Rowan, staying strictly in pairs. The moment we passed the flooded corridors, subtle vibrations pulsed through the steel floors, and faint echoes of whispering seemed to drift along the walls. I didn't respond, not verbally, not mentally. I didn't even glance toward the corners where shadows twisted unnaturally. The rig's own mechanism seemed alive, echoing the movements of the unknown beneath. It was a delicate balance, awareness without engagement. The difference between survival and disaster was often the smallest mental decision, the faintest acknowledgement of the unexplainable. Weeks later, I saw a new crew member nearly succumb to the rule, alone, inspecting a submerged corridor. He paused mid-step, tilting his head as if listening. A whisper reached him, faint but unmistakable, repeating his name. I grabbed him before he could respond, dragging him back to the safe zone. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending, and I could feel the subtle marks left on him, the lingering effect of recognition. The rig remembers who fails, the depths remember who responds. And that is why Rule 9 exists. The simplest sound, a name called from the depths, can set in motion events that no human foresight can correct. From that day onward, I patrol with constant vigilance. Any faint murmur or movement triggers immediate retreat, communication with a partner, and strict adherence to protocols. The rig itself seems to enforce this, amplifying sounds and shadows to test obedience. Those who respond are marked, subtly but irreversibly, their perception of reality warped. I have seen evidence of it in subtle behavioral changes, in tremors, in hesitation, traces left by interaction with the voices in the depths. It's a silent warning, written into the fabric of the rig and the ocean below. Even now, when I move through the lower decks, I silently recite Rule 9. I avoid glancing at shadows, or listening too intently for anything unnatural. The voice calling my name is a temptation I must never satisfy, a lure meant to bend my awareness. The submerged sections, the rig and the unknown forces that inhabit these depths are patient, deliberate, and persistent. They will wait for a moment of weakness, and any response, any acknowledgement, is the first step toward disaster. I had grown accustomed to the rig's routines, the alarms, the submerged sections, and the diving bell, but nothing prepared me for Rule 10. Never open the storage crates that arrive from the trench unlabeled. It was during a late-night inventory check that I noticed a crate sitting alone on the cargo platform, its exterior weathered, salt-streaked, and completely unmarked. All crates typically had tags, documentation, and sensor readings. This one had none. My curiosity battled with instinct. I had been warned repeatedly by Rowan and the veterans. The trench sends up more than equipment, and some things are better left sealed. But the rigid human impulse to know what lies inside gnawed at me. As I circled the crate, the metal under my boots hummed faintly, almost like the machinery itself, was warning me away. The crate was cold, far colder than the surrounding air, and moisture beaded along the seams. I tapped it lightly, listening to a hollow sound that suggested it was far larger inside than it appeared. The faint vibration beneath my hands made the hairs on my arms rise. For a moment, I considered leaving it alone, moving on to the documented crates, but the compulsion to inspect grew stronger with each passing second. That is precisely why the rule existed. The trench does not forgive curiosity, and those crates are not merely containers. They are thresholds for what emerges from unimaginable depths. I reached for the latch, hesitated, and felt a subtle resistance, as if the crate itself was aware of my intention. A faint pulse ran through the platform beneath me, making the deck creak. I could hear the rig settling, steel contracting and groaning, yet there was something more, a quiet, almost imperceptible hum that didn't belong to the machinery. Shadows from overhead cranes shifted, and the reflected light danced oddly across the platform. The sensation was disorienting, as if the crate existed slightly out of phase with reality. My training screamed to back away, but my hands moved, as though they were not my own, guided by the inexplicable pull of the unknown. A sudden gust of wind swept across the deck, carrying with it a scent of brine, decay, and something metallic, yet unidentifiable. I shivered, gripping the latch more tightly, the metal cold against my gloves. The rig's lights flickered for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I could swear the shadows surrounding the crate seemed to twist toward me, pressing in subtly, testing my nerve. The urge to obey the rule clashed with a maddening curiosity. What could be inside a crate that bypassed all standard labeling and protocol? That very tension, the lure of forbidden knowledge, is exactly what the rule warns against. I forced myself to step back and call Rowan, explaining the presence of the crate. The response was immediate, his voice tense. "Do not touch it, not a single latch. Leave it where it is." I could hear the firmness in his tone, and yet the crate seemed to hum at me still, as if mocking my hesitation. The rig itself seemed to respond to my defiance, vibrations amplifying underfoot, steel creaking and settling with unnatural emphasis. I realized then that the crate is more than an object. It is an agent of the trench, a vessel for things human eyes are not meant to see, and its very presence is a test of discipline, patience, and survival instinct. Hours passed as I monitored the crate, without moving closer. Every so often, the hum increased slightly, subtle ripples in the air, water droplets along the seams, forming patterns I could not interpret. The rig's machinery seemed to echo its rhythms, amplifying the sense of life within the inanimate container. At one point, a shadow passed across the surface, although nothing human had moved nearby. I could feel the crate's presence in my mind, a faint pressure that whispered and nudged, and every instinct urged me to obey. Ignoring the rule would not be fatal immediately, but the consequences would linger, subtle and relentless, testing my awareness for days afterward. The next morning, during a proper daylight inspection, a team arrived to handle the crate. I observed closely, noting the careful procedures employed to move it with minimal disturbance. Every step was deliberate, lifts were slow, grips were firm but gentle, and all interactions were measured. It was clear that veterans treated these crates with respect bordering on fear. The unspoken knowledge was that breaking Rule 10 has repercussions that extend beyond the immediate physical environment. Something comes with the crate from the trench, and while not always visible, its influence is insidious, capable of affecting perception, emotion, and cognition. Later that week, a rumor circulated among the crew about a junior worker who had opened a similar crate months prior. No one spoke of it openly, but the signs were clear: paranoia, strange behavior, whispers of unseen movement in empty corridors, and reports of faint sounds echoing through the rig at night. He had survived, barely, but the marks remained, not physical, but psychological, persistent and growing. That is the essence of Rule 10. The trench sends up things humans cannot fully comprehend, and the crate acts as both guardian and messenger. Opening it without cause invites attention, and the consequences are subtle, slow, and often irreversible. Now, whenever crates arrive from the trench unlabeled, I circle them, but never touch. I observe, record anomalies, and maintain distance. I remind myself silently of the rule. It exists because curiosity can be fatal. The rig enforces compliance with quiet precision, and those who disobey are tested, observed, and marked in ways that may only become apparent long after the incident. Even the faintest vibration or hum in the crate demands respect, reminding me that the trench and its artifacts are patient, deliberate, and aware. At the end of my shift, the crate remained untouched, its surface cold, damp, and enigmatic. I left it in place, monitoring from a distance, listening to the subtle echoes of its presence in the steel and water around it. Every shadow, every creak, every faint pulse underfoot served as a reminder. Curiosity has boundaries, and the trench enforces them through patience and quiet power. I learned that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some rules exist, not for convenience, but for survival. Rule 10 is one such rule, a boundary between human impulse and the unknown forces that dwell in the abyss. I had spent months on the rig, learning each rule by experience, surviving situations that tested the limits of sanity and endurance. Yet nothing prepared me for the weight of Rule 11. Never use the lift that arrives empty. That night, after the day's shift ended, I found myself on the upper deck, watching the lift descend silently through the hollow shaft. The cabin doors opened with a soft hiss, but no one was inside. The lights flickered faintly, reflecting off the steel walls, creating elongated shadows that seemed to stretch and reach toward me. My gut twisted as a faint sense of wrongness settled over me, a visceral warning that this was different from any other moment on the rig. I hesitated, hand hovering over the door, heart pounding. A part of me knew that the lift was not just a mechanical device. It was a threshold, a conduit between levels of the rig, and perhaps beyond. The emptiness was deliberate, and the silence of the cabin suggested something unnatural, yet exhaustion, curiosity, and the human impulse to reach the lower decks before the morning inspection almost compelled me forward. I reminded myself silently of the rule. It wasn't just about safety. The rig had taught me through every rule before that disobedience invites unseen consequences. As I stepped inside, the lift doors closed behind me without a touch. Immediately, a subtle vibration ran through the floor, steady and rhythmic, as though the lift itself had taken a breath. The dim overhead lights reflected off the metal, creating patterns that seemed to twist unnaturally. Shadows coalesced in the corners, forming shapes that were almost humanoid, but never entirely. My instincts screamed to press the emergency stop and flee, but the controls felt heavier, reluctant, as though resisting my intervention. The air inside the lift grew colder, tinged with a metallic scent that was neither oil nor rust, but something older, deeper, and alive. Halfway down, I noticed reflections in the polished steel walls that weren't my own, brief glimpses of figures moving behind me, or rather in sync with me, impossible to place in reality yet undeniable. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue or my imagination, but the sensation of being observed grew stronger, oppressive. The lift descended silently, but not uniformly. The subtle jerks and pauses didn't match any mechanical pattern I knew. It was almost as if the lift had its own will, deliberate and calculated. I remembered Rowan's words when he emphasized the final rule: the lift is patient. It waits for the weak, the impulsive, the rule breaker. Suddenly the lights dimmed further, leaving me in partial shadow. I felt an almost imperceptible shift in gravity, a tug that didn't make sense in a vertical shaft. The lift seemed to slow even though I hadn't touched any controls. Then came the softest whisper, a voice so faint it could have been carried by the steel walls. "You shouldn't be here." My pulse quickened, hands clammy against the rail. I realized in that moment why Rule 11 exists. The lift is more than a vehicle. It is a sentinel, a passageway that separates those who obey from those who disobey. those who survive from those who vanish. The descent continued, each floor passing in an unnatural sequence. I could swear the numbering didn't match the rig's blueprints. The indicators, flickering between levels, I didn't recognize. Panic began to rise, tempered only by a mechanical precision in my mind. I couldn't afford to lose rationality now. Shadows moved just outside the lift cabin, flickering in rhythm with the strange vibration beneath my feet. I pressed the emergency stop again, but the buttons were unresponsive, as though the lift itself had decided I must complete this journey. Every story I had heard of disappearances on rigs, unexplainable shifts, and vanished crew members surged in my memory. By the time I reached what I assumed to be the bottom, the doors opened with a slow, deliberate hiss. The corridor beyond was unfamiliar, metal walls slick with condensation, dim lights casting long shadows that seemed to twist toward me. I stepped out cautiously, senses heightened, aware that Rule 11 was not just about physical safety. It governed interaction with forces beyond human comprehension. Every instinct told me to retreat, but the lift behind me remained open, silent, empty, waiting. The rig's presence was palpable, alive, observing my every move. The floor beneath me vibrated subtly as I walked, each step echoing unnaturally. Water pooled in corners, reflecting distorted shadows. I could feel eyes everywhere, or perhaps I imagined them, but the feeling was undeniable. The lift had delivered me not merely to a level of the rig, but to a place of exposure, a boundary that existed between safety and the unknown. I remembered all the previous rules: alarms, diving bells, submerged sections, voices and crates. They were precursors, training for this final, ultimate threshold. One misstep now could render months of vigilance meaningless. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear voices beyond the faint creak of steel and the distant hum of machinery, yet the awareness of being watched was overwhelming. Every muscle tensed, every nerve heightened. The lift waited behind me, patient, deliberate, almost expectant. I realized that Rule 11 is the culmination of all previous rules. It tests discipline, fear, restraint, and respect for forces beyond the human mind. It isn't just a rule, it's a boundary, a final measure, a threshold that separates survival from what lies beyond comprehension. Even now, I avoid lifts that arrive empty. I patrol carefully, inspect mechanically, and never approach without a second person, yet the memory lingers. The lift was patient, silent, but it marked me, its presence lingering in ways subtle and pervasive. Shadows in the corridors, ripples in the water, faint vibrations underfoot, they all serve as reminders. The rig itself seems aware, watching, assessing, and occasionally testing, even after compliance. One mistake, one step too far, and the consequences may be immediate, or slow, subtle, or violent, but inevitable. As I leave the deck, I glance at the lift again. It sits there, doors closed, silent, unassuming to the casual eye, yet alive to those who know better. The knowledge of Rule 11 now permeates my every decision, every patrol, every inspection. It is more than a guideline. It is a sentinel, a reminder that the rig and the trench harbor forces that respond to human action with deliberate precision. I never use that lift again, unless absolutely necessary, never alone, and never without full awareness. And even then, the fear remains. What happens when the lift waits, and you step inside? If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.